Today I'm going to talk to you about something that really transcends three of my favorite topics, right? Supply chain, data, and beer. I'm going to talk to you about our journey at Anheuser-Busch and specifically within the supply chain when it comes to data analytics. But my hope here is that really you can take away, regardless of the size of your organization, regardless of the industry that you work in, really have some key takeaways and find some synergies with maybe you're going through a similar journey, maybe you already went through a similar journey in the past, and currently in a much more advanced state with data. Maybe you're just getting started out, right? So regardless of where you're at, hopefully you can find some synergies here with some of the bullet points I'll lay out. So the beer supply chain is incredibly complex, right? I think a lot of the topics we saw this morning, for example, in the food industry, the beverage industry, just overall, fast-moving consumer goods, lots of opportunities. We could sit here for an hour, right? I can talk to you about what goes into the beer supply chain from raw materials with hops and grains, all the way to getting that beer to the shelves in the grocery store, to the liquor store, to the bars and restaurants. But I'm not going to do that, right? Just because we're limited on time. What I thought I'd rather do is just kind of put a few graphics out there from a geographical perspective that kind of outline various tiers on our supply chain, right? So just kind of going here from left to right, we have our very broad footprint of breweries, craft breweries, verticalized ops, right? Can plants to generate all the cans. We have a very large distribution and lane network, right? That mostly transcends transportation for trucks, but also rail, as well as some intermodal. And then we also have our network of wholesalers, right? We have about 600 wholesalers in the U.S. And what you don't see here is the logistics between the wholesalers to get that to the liquor stores, the grocery stores, the restaurants, the bars, where you as the consumer go and take that product home, or perhaps you consume it at the sporting event or at the restaurant and whatnot. So a lot of complexities in the supply chain, like many other industries. And if we look at our supply chain functions here at Anheuser-Busch, right, we have a lot of different teams, and these are actually only a fraction of the teams that we have. These are kind of the core ones, right? We have partners in procurement and shared services that work to make this happen, right? Again, the transportation side, the warehousing side, the production planning, a lot of good talent, a lot of good teams and organizations that make the magic happen behind the scenes, so that when that person goes and gets Busch Light or Goose IPA or Legion Space Dust, there's a lot of work that has gone into that beer. So what do they do to create put in a lot of those efforts, right? Obviously, a lot of good people, a lot of good processes, and a lot of technology. I think this morning in some of the presentations we talked about ERP systems, right? About the prevalence of those and how many fragments of systems we can have. So at AB, we're no different. We have a ton of different systems. We actually have our in-house legacy systems, right? That decades ago we developed, or engineers developed. And we have some third-party systems. Maybe some of you guys recognize some of these companies and some of these icons, SAP, O9 Solutions, Blue Yonder, perhaps some companies that you work with. And so behind each of these systems lays a ton of data, right? And a lot of times it's more data than we know what to do with. Like I'm talking millions of bytes of data, gigabytes and gigabytes of data. Imagine hundreds of database tables filled with all sorts of information. Anything you want, you can probably find in the systems. Again, the problem here isn't having very little data. It's almost like having too much data, right? Because you're going to now transform this data into insights, into actions. And so what do? We hired people over the years that have good data skills, right? Perhaps graduate of business schools, graduate of engineering schools, very talented people. And we said, okay, these are the skills I want. I want people who know how to use or know how to make Power BI and Tableau dashboards, some people with some coding skills. So certain skills we're looking for. And then over the time, our toolkit has kind of expanded to say, hey, I'm going to start with the basics, maybe have an intern or contractor or an analyst come in, make some Excel dashboards. I'm going to get some cooler looking tools here like ClickSense and Power BI and Tableau. Maybe work with IT a little bit to create an enterprise data warehouse, but again, we have all these systems. We're trying to combine the data we have, and then get the talent to be able to use that data, and then actually create that dashboard, create that insight into what we want, right? And so if you look at how our organization is mapped, this is kind of what it looks like, right? We have those people, and they're kind of scattered across these different teams, right? So you might have a small planning analytics or data team. You might have, if I'm looking at the warehousing, the OTR, and the dedicated transportation, we have like a tier 1 transportation analytics team. So the game here is clear, right? If you're on the business, I want people with good data skills, right? And if I have those people on my team, I'm probably going to have a competitive advantage there, and I'm going to be able to do great things and get the insights I need and get the actions I need. So this is awesome, right? We have really good analytics and visibility, and I'm only scratching the surface here with dashboards. Obviously, there's more than just dashboards and reporting when it comes to data analytics. But after a while, you start to ask some questions, right? Leadership, everybody across the organization say, okay, I'm looking at my KPI, my miles per barrel. Why is it showing two different values across two different reports? All right, why do we have so many redundant and different looking reports and sets of data, right? And again, maybe these are some of the questions that even your organization you ask. We have tons of data. I can't even calculate a basic metric like pallets per labor hour to measure my productivity in my brewery or my facility. We have this awesome Power BI that's connected to our WMS, right, to our warehouse management system. Why is it only showing the last 6 months of data? What if I want to see 2021? What if I want to see 2019, 2020? Where did that data go, right? Why is our transportation KPI not working this week, right? Why don't I have good visibility into how we're calculating compliance metrics? I mean, the list goes on and on. Again, we make changes, things break. We have weekly KPI meetings, right, with our teams, tons of different KPIs for different metrics. And then, it's always so slow, right? Why is this dashboard so slow? It's been loading for the past 15 minutes. Maybe you guys don't have this problem. Maybe it's just an Anheuser-Busch problem, but something tells me at one point in our careers, maybe even now, you dealt with some of these issues before. And so the reason is we look under the hood, and we obviously have the classic iceberg here. We use different analogies at AB for data. We have the spaghetti, we have the house, the iceberg, the hood. We'll talk about some of those things. But there's a lot going on here behind the scenes that over the years we've just kind of developed, and we don't always know exactly what's happening, right? We only see the top. We don't really know what's happening behind the scenes, where that data's coming from. How do these systems really talk to each other? Again, with the growing supply chain complexity comes growing system complexities in data. So we have this classic iceberg, and one of the things from a people and organization perspective is really the data silos we talked about, right? So already talked about the problem of from a people perspective, right? We have these fragmented teams that may not be talking to each other. Maybe they're not aligned in their routines and their ways of working. And literally the data itself is siloed, right? So, craft planning team, right? So Anheuser-Busch owns actually about a dozen or so craft breweries. They have their own databases where they lock their data up. The planning execution team, they have this data warehouse that they built. So the data is literally siloed and locked up in a lot of cases. And this symbol right here is supposed to notate the IT organization. Again, varying different relationships we have with the IT team that sometimes the people in IT don't even know what's going on, right? So we go and open a ticket with our IT team. Sorry, can't help you. That's an in-house thing. You're on your own. Good luck finding and fetching your data, right? So this is one of the spider web of the spaghetti analogies I was talking about. What we have here then is a very complex, overly complex data architecture that literally looks like a spider web, right? And I don't know if you guys can see, but that is a Windows XP logo in the middle of the screen. So if you recall about 20 years ago with the rolling hills, believe it or not, we have a virtual machine that runs Windows XP that kicks off a lot of jobs that generate the data. So that's, when I say legacy here, that's very legacy. Here's another perspective, same story, but a cool little graphic that we have. This is what we call the spaghetti, just to illustrate this. This is only a sliver, right? This is only the Power BI piece of the overly redundant reports and models and data connections we have. Again, different graphics, same story here to kind of highlight the problems. And so again, going back to the iceberg, what's actually going on here is, again, if you take a step back and look at our data foundation, it's either not there or again, over time, without a central data strategy that's aligned with your supply chain strategy, we haven't really developed that single source of truth for a lot of KPIs. We have fragmented knowledge and tech. We have silos. We have, sometimes self-service data strategy with some opportunities. Poor practices, aging out, outdating tech, right? So again, talked about Windows XP, but we have several other pieces of technology that the company just has not made the investment as needed over the years. And of course, as the volume of data grows, I think I read a statistics out there. I think that 90% of the world's data was generated in the last 2 years, right? So you can imagine that exponential rate. You have to have investments in the right technology. Lack of a data catalog, right? We could ask half our business teams, hey, how's this KPI actually calculated? What's the data lineage? What systems does it touch? How is it generated? What's the documentation? So tons of different opportunities here, right? Why does something break when we make a change? Do we have a proper production environment set up to where we can, or a non-production environment, like a dev or test environment that we can actually test these changes, right? Like the good old adage goes, you're testing something either way. It's just a matter of if you test it in a test environment or when it goes into production and you test something and then you shut down a brewery, right? And the brewery can't get the trucks out the door because the system goes down. So a ton of opportunities there. So we took a step back, right? And we've been doing this a lot for the last few years, but especially about a year ago at this point, last November, we created a central team, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it really comes down to taking a step back, recognizing the good visibility and insights we have, right? Because there's good work done there in the past that we don't necessarily just want to throw away. We want to recognize the achievements there, but we want to take a step back and say, okay, let's work on a data strategy and a supply chain strategy that's aligned, right? And a lot of the times that starts with the leadership team. So from a top-down alignment perspective, we essentially got with the supply chain leadership team and said, what are the most important pillars for you? What are the most important KPIs and metrics? And how can we partner together there to at least have a starting point? And if you ask me personally, we've gotten better at this. We're not there yet. We're not perfect. I think we have a lot of room to grow. But ultimately, that's kind of where it starts out with. We want to reduce our variable logistics costs. We want to improve, so safety and quality is really big for us at Anheuser-Busch, right? Our breweries, our distribution centers, we don't want people getting hurt. We also want the quality of our beers that's making it to you. We want that Budweiser, we want that Stella, et cetera, to be of the utmost quality. And beer is a perishable product, right? So depending on the brand, anywhere from 4 months to a year. After a while, it spoils and goes bad. So all these things are important to us that we have to have alignment with the supply chain leadership team for. But at the same time, we have to push some bottom-up foundation, right? And those are the things that I talked about earlier with the iceberg and some opportunities or that questions that are asked. So how do we have a good data certification process to have that single source of truth, right? I want one KPI. I want to know what it is. I don't want 5 different values, whether they vary by decimal point or even greater magnitude. We can't be, like these KPIs are what's driving our business, right? They're operationally how we gauge how we're doing from a service level, from a cost, from a safety and quality standpoint. Implementing a modern cloud-based architecture, which we'll talk about that in a second. Things like data quality monitoring. I don't want to go to a meeting, or I don't want the business to go in a meeting into like an SOP meeting with sales, and then, oh, the dashboard hasn't updated. The numbers are incorrect. We have to be proactive about that. We have to have alerts. We have to have, at 4 in the morning, our ship needs to know, hey, these pipelines failed, and heads up team, for your 10 o'clock S&OP meeting, this data is not available. We're working behind the scenes. So that's the culture. We talked a lot about this morning with change management. That's kind of the change management what we're trying to implement is not always technology, but just a change of mindset. And of course, documentation, data democratization. I'm going to touch upon these in a little bit more detail later on. So like I said earlier, we did create one supply chain analytics team for the entire supply chain organization, or almost all of it. And again, this is a concept and a team that's new and growing at Anheuser-Busch. Partnering with our teams in IT, right, and in North America's own technology and beer tech, and ultimately consolidating a lot of these efforts, consolidating a lot of our talent, and kind of breaking down those silos. So one thing I want to throw in here is also, and I'll get to the people aspect here in a minute, right? Because we just talked about a new team. Obviously, we want to talk about the people work that goes into that. We really want to treat data as a product and have that mindset, right? And no matter your industry, again, the size of the organization, I think that's very good to keep in mind. Obviously, here I'm talking about beer, right? That's the forefront of mind right now for the industry that I'm in. But for you, like whatever your product is, whether it's tangible or intangible, think of it as like a product, right? So and you can substitute data as a product here for any question that we ask, but like, is it accessible, right? How does our data benefit customers, i.e. our stakeholders? What support do we offer, right? How do we measure the success? We're talking about creating KPIs for our own work, right, in supply chain. Okay, like a quality index. What's the quality of our data? A net promoter score. Are people happy? How's our product currently being used today, right? How's our data being used today? How can it be used in the future? How do our stakeholders view our data, right? What feedback can they provide us? So this data as a product mindset, in my opinion, is a very, very important tool that we've kind of developed and culturally embedded in all the work that we do. And no matter what we do, if we keep that in mind, we can continuously improve and work on all the things that we talked about that are more technical, right? Data quality, data documentation, data cataloging, and so forth. Want to inject one more piece here. So I didn't put the link up here, but if you want to Google Just Engage, he has an interesting article out there about data as a product mentality and how that evolves to data as a service. Now, the data as a service here is a little bit more different than the traditional definition you might find on the web. But the only distinction I want to make here for you all is kind of, as we talk about the data as a product mindset, we also have kind of a different approach, which is how do we tackle with the business, with the supply chain leadership team, for example, to look at a specific problem, right? So maybe your data analytics team at your company or your organization partners with the S&OP team or the planning execution team or the over-the-road transportation team to tackle a specific KPI or problem and have a routine around that, right? So bottom line is, as you're formulating or evolving your supply chain analytics team, you definitely want to think about different types of analytics out there. You want to think about how you want to position your team, because this is also going to help you how you get the right people on the team, right? Which we'll talk about in the next slide or two, because sometimes the skill sets look a little different, right? Depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So with that being said, there's a ton of, you type in data online, right? And there's a ton of different titles out there, a ton of different positions, data analyst, data scientist, data engineer. And again, what works for Anheuser-Busch right now in the supply chain analytics team, which I'll talk about, the two positions we have, might look different for you. But for us, we said, we need data engineers and we need BI developers or BI engineers, right? And they come with a certain skill set, obviously, that develops the foundation we need and also sets our team up for success, because as we'll see in my final closing slide or two, we're not just setting up the foundation for today's initiatives. We're thinking about a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, as we become a tech-first and data-first beer company, right? How do we want to evolve there, right? So you always kind of have to think about the future. And in 3 years, this might look different, right? That's always like a matter of continuous learning and looking back, looking inwards and saying, okay, what has worked for us on our team and what's an opportunity? So keeping the team engaged. I actually put some pictures here of our team from a month or two ago. So in September, early September, we had an engagement event here. So we are a hybrid team, right? So about half our team, which is a dozen people now, looking to grow that going into next year, works in different states and different parts of the country. But more importantly, like baseball games and brewery tours, that's secondary, right? That's secondary engagement. Primary engagement is how do we create a good working environment and a culture, remote or not, that gives them for us, one of the big selling points is we're a stable, secure industry, right? Beer consumption shifted from on-premise to off-premise during the pandemic, but people still drink beer. But it's almost like you're working for a tech startup in a giant beer company that has that stability, right? So that's what works for us from an engagement and marketing perspective when we're looking for talent. For you, it might look a little bit different. But ultimately, we offer a ton of learning opportunities. What we found with our data people is that the more they are aware of the initiatives that are going on from a business supply chain perspective, the happier they are, the more engaged they are, and the better at what they do, right? So these people are not, they're not machines who come in and code for you. So the more context we can provide them of why this is important for the business and why it's important for our supply chain, if we want to get beer out in the safest, most efficient, productive manner, they have to understand what they're doing from a broader context perspective instead of just hiring somebody and say, I want you to create me that report or dashboard, or hey, let's have you write some code that pulls in data from your TMS or from your WMS and then spits it onto a data warehouse and then done, right? So we found that a lot of those strategies work well. So we formulated the team, right? We took a step back, kind of aligned our business strategy and our supply chain strategy. And this people hiring and recruitment and engagement thing is something that we're continuously working on. But one of the things that we're starting out with, and this is honestly a multi-year initiative, and one of the boxes that I was talking about earlier when we had that bottom-up data foundation, is modernizing our data architecture, right? And there's a lot of technology and a lot of concepts here that I'm not going to go into too much detail. If anybody that was interested in any particular technology, happy to speak with you afterwards. But ultimately, the key selling point here, especially when we talk to supply chain leadership, is the why, right? We need to be able to explain the why of we're moving to the cloud, right? Not because it's the coolest, trendiest thing to do, but why is it important from a reliability and uptime perspective? Why it beats staying on Windows XP, for the next 20 years, why it's better from a, anomaly detection perspective. Hey, this report said, or, maybe this data pipeline that we're establishing in the cloud said, we sold, 50 billion barrels yesterday. Something clearly is not, working, right? We didn't sell 50 billion barrels yesterday, even though that's what we may want. So having those things, having the proper speed focused or performance optimized data models, the more we can kind of hammer on the whys, we found is the best way to kind of sell leadership, sell the business on our strategy when we're modernizing the data architecture rather than say, hey, we need to implement a data lake or we need to move to the cloud, right? It helps to explain the reasoning behind those. So data governance, right, goes hand in hand. There's a lot of pillars here that you can research on data governance. It's more than just documentation, but I do want to focus on the documentation piece because a lot of our silos from in the past, when, again, interns, contractors, managers, analysts, they came in and they moved on to the new roles, they got promoted, or maybe they left the company, right? Or maybe it was a temporary summer assignment. They come in and they work on things and they leave. Same goes with like other initiatives around data, and there's very little to no documentation, right? And in spirit of the agile methodology, and we'll talk about that in a slide or two, you don't have to write a book, right? It's like the old like VCRs or like older technology where you got a DVD player or VCR, there's a whole manual. Nobody reads that, right? Whereas today, if you buy your iPhone or some other new modern tech, there's no manual, right? But what there is like a more graphics-oriented, simple pamphlet of how do you charge your iPhone, and keeping it very simple with diagrams and whatnot. So that's definitely what we're trying to establish here. We're not trying to write a book on everything we do, but it is a core component of the process that we're trying to implement. So it's not just all technology, but how do you sustain that so that when Kevin moves on to the next role X years from now, this thing doesn't come crumbling down, and we have efforts in there to capture that knowledge, whether it's business knowledge or data knowledge with some of our things in our ecosystem. So this is what I was talking about earlier. So we are using the Scrum Framework, right? So and this touches upon both the business side and the supply chain side, but also for engagement of your teams. Everybody appreciates a routine, right? So whether we're talking about SNOE, SNOP, or some other routines that we have, we have so many different routines, so many different meetings. For your data analytics efforts and for the people you have, the routine also applies, right? So be able to work in 2-week sprints, deliver in increments, right? Being able to have a ticketing system aboard where we can capture all our effort, and at the end of the day, or more realistically, at the end of the month or the quarter, we can say this is the work that's been put in, goes leaps and bounds, right? There's a ton of value there, and be able to track everything we're doing and then showcase that to the stakeholders involved. So data certification, liberating democracy of data. So a lot of buzzwords in here, but let me break it down here because this is a fundamental part of our data strategy. You have got to democratize data in your own way, right? That does not mean, and this closely relates to the next slide on educating people, which I'll talk about. Not everybody in your company or in your team needs to be able to code in SQL or Python. Not everybody needs to be able to create a dashboard. But what we need to do is those people who are doing those things, we need to democratize this data in the right way, right? Working in, through the right channels, using the right data so people aren't going off and doing their own things. And for the people who are consuming it, right, we want to establish some baseline of data literacy, right? Again, data literacy will depend on your audience. We don't want executives having to write code to pull, how much, space dust we sold the other month. But data democratization, data literacy, educating the business really kind of depends on your audience, the skill set you have, but there is a right way to do things, right? Because otherwise, right, if we kind of open up the floodgates, we're just going to go back into our old ways of working where everybody's creating data in silos, people develop their own reporting, and there's a lot of fragmented processes and technologies and data floating around. So again, very related to the previous slide, which one thing that I didn't talk about on the previous slide as well, but I'll talk about here is our data cataloging, right? I guess like really going back to that really quick. Data catalog, so metadata, right? Data about data. Where is this data located? How can I get my TMS data, right? Any question you have about data that probably falls within the data cataloging and metadata management space, we need good documentation in these efforts if we're going to be able to set that up for a lot of other stuff, right? Just some highlights with, again, on our topic of education and communication and data literacy. We're trying different things, right? And we tried a couple of different things as well that did not work, that I did not put on the slide. But we have office hours every week with the business, right, to handle address their data and analytics concerns or questions or comments. We send out a monthly newsletter, right? We have quarterly steercos. We have training opportunities. We explain how things work, again, focusing on the why. All these elements, right, of communication, education, again, they should be part of your data strategy and supply chain strategy as we try to educate really any and all stakeholders involved that touches data, which hopefully in your organization, especially going forward, is everybody, right? Everybody is becoming more and more data driven, hence, even why this is even more important. Keep it up with changing technology, right? So here I'm segueing into a little bit more future trends and looking forward. But ultimately, in this space, data and I'll say technology, and I'll talk about the data piece in a second. It is changing rapidly, right? And so the two ways that I kind of broke it down here, and this is only just a fraction of how to look at this, but the supply chain tech is always changing, right? Whether we want to have one magical application that does it all, unlikely, at least for now, or we have different vendors coming in. This might be a little bit of a build or buy situation as well, right? So we have technologies at Anheuser-Busch that we bought and we have technologies that we build, and that comes to different things that I'm not going to get into at this moment. But the technology is always changing, and then at the same time, the data analytics framework is also changing, right? So, we went from, data warehousing in the 80s and 90s to data lakes in the early 2000s and 2010s, and now we're talking about combining those things, having like a lakehouse architecture, getting to the concept of like a federated data mesh, right? Every other week, you can go online, you can go on to see whatever the latest trends in data analytics are, and there's new ideas out there. And what I'll say here, so we're keeping a strong pulse on both sides. We made the mistake in the past of not keeping up, right? So a lot of the legacy systems that I talked about in the past that were actually incrementally working to replace, they were cutting edge at one point, right? When they came out in the 90s, for example, they were state of the art. They were ahead of its time with some of the web portals we had. And the company did not make the necessary investments, and we quickly fell behind. And the last 3 to 5 years, we're starting to see a rebound of our tech investment and whatnot under the current leadership. So my key message there to everyone in this room is, don't fall behind, because what you think is cutting edge now may not be 5 years from now, whether that comes to your ERP systems that you have or the way that you set up your data architecture. Things are always changing, and they're changing very, very fast in those spaces. So this is I guess technically not my last slide, because I want to recap here in a minute, but this is kind of my closing out the forward-looking piece. And that really comes to what's our fundamental goal here, right? I don't think anybody likes building data warehouses and data lakes just for the fun of it, or just having meetings over and over again, whether it's supply chain meetings or tech meetings. Ultimately, we're trying to build out the supply chain of the future and create a competitive advantage, and really going back to our dream, which is how do we get the beers out there from a supply chain perspective, so that we can create a better world, right, for a future with more cheers. So ultimately, it's about getting more beers in a better way at the hands of the consumer. So as we're talking about data analytics, we're really talking about the supply chain of the future that we want to create for tomorrow, right? The next few years and a decade out. And of course, there's a couple of different pillars that we're exploring here. And, everybody's hearing all these things that are rapidly evolving around machine learning and AI. We want to more accurately, those KPIs that we talked about earlier, right, in line with the team, we want to more accurately predict future outcomes. We want to tackle specific problems, right? So there's definitely more than a couple of problems in the supply chain, but like two main areas that I'll call out is we talked about this morning about the impacts of the last couple of years, right? So we had a huge shift from bottles and draft to cans, right? So people hunkered down, they stayed at home, they're buying Pelotons, they're buying, I think bathroom mirrors was the example earlier. Whatever they're buying at home, they're also buying more cans and less bottles and draft when they're drinking their beer, right? Less at sporting events, less at restaurants and bars, and more at grocery stores and liquor stores. So that rapidly changed the can dynamic to the point where we had to import a lot of cans. And at the same time, we also have a ton of increasing complexity. I think I pulled this off one of our sites, and this is actually only a small fraction of the brands we have, but the amount of beer brands we have today is insane, right? And that kind of goes back to consumer preference, which again, we talked about in earlier presentations. But ultimately, 30 or 40 years ago, instead of, it was Bud Light, Michelob, and maybe a couple other things. Now we have so many different brand families. We have all these acquisitions in craft. We have Beyond Beer, right, which is non-alcoholic, but also non-beer alcohol. So that includes like spirits and cocktails, canned wine, and so forth. Tons of SKUs, tons of packaging, right? I think Bud Light, there's like 40 or 50 different SKU configurations, depending on the size of the can, size of the aluminum bottle, size of the glass bottle, the size of the draft. But ultimately, it's all about tackling these things and using data analytics as kind of that centerpiece of your people, process, technology framework, right? So we talked about people there, right? Getting the right people, educating them, communicating to them, making them more data literate. Process, obviously, embedding data in every step of the process, and vice versa, right? Embedding good processes in your data. And then, of course, technology, with it rapidly changing from a broad, general data analytics perspective, but also specifically in supply chain, you have new technologies, new vendors, or maybe you say, I don't want this vendor, I'm going to build my own supply chain tech. Doesn't even have to be complex, but the technology is obviously a critical piece there. But data is really the foundation of all those three pillars in that framework. And again, goes back to how do we build a supply chain of the future? And for our company, that means getting the beer to the consumer in the best way possible. So can't end this without having a few recap bullet points, right? So again, my point here was to highlight our journey in Anheuser-Busch with supply chain analytics, but I think these takeaways, regardless of your industry and your organization, you can find some synergies here, right? So understanding your current tech, right? What does your current data and reporting look like? What does your current analytics look like? And then if you find similar opportunities, right, and maybe you're starting out your journey there, maybe you're more well-established, but I think ultimately it's good to take a step back and see, are your supply chain and your data strategies aligned, right? Kind of have that bottom-up and top-down mindset. Break down data silos and think of your data as a product, right? A lot of those same questions that you would ask about any product or service or any tangible or intangible product, you can ask the same for data, and that can start getting you thinking about the things that you want to address. Hiring the right people and keep them engaged. So one thing I didn't mention earlier, and I'll mention now, is don't think you need like an internal, and again, depending on your industry, your company, or the size of your organization, don't find it necessary that you need like 10 data engineers and BI engineers on your team. We actually started out with contractors. We still have some contractors. We have some vendors. So your data analytics team doesn't even have to be full-time employees, right? But the question asked there is, what are the right partners you need, right? Whether they're internal people or maybe some firms that you want to work with, and what are your objectives there? What are the skill sets you want? Modernizing your data architecture and promote good data governance. Focus on the why there, right? We in the beer industry, we don't really deal with sensitive data, like we're not in the financial or healthcare industry, but security and compliance and all those things with data matters. Documentation matters, good data catalogs and metadata management matters. And of course, being agile, iterating and learning continuously, I think that benefits the supply chain side and any data teams you work with. Democratizing data, really continue on education, right? Education is key when it comes to these topics, and especially finding people in your team that can explain these concepts in a way that everybody can understand, right? Because you start throwing certain buzzwords out there and you might start losing some people, but the more you can kind of, again, explain the why and the reasoning behind them, the better. And then not falling behind with changing technology, I think is a big one. And then finally, using data analytics to create your supply chain of the future, right? Whatever you envision your supply chain looking like in 5 years and 10 years or more, where does data analytics fit into that space? Hopefully it's a central component, but breaking down the mechanics of that to see what you can do to be able to make that dream a reality. Thank you.